Okay. This is the Italian part of the 15th century. And so they have similar ideas. One is realism. They kind of take a little bit of different approach to all of this. This is the sacrifice of Isaac, and it was a competition to do the baptistry doors, and it was going to be sculpture that was like a lot of the stuff I just showed you in Northern Europe. That sculpture was primarily there to embellish or decorate architecture. And so anyway, this guy here, he lost the competition. This is one of the famous art history stories. He lost the competition and decided to pursue architecture. The guy who won is this guy, Gilberti, and you can see this is another bronze. And it's about the sacrifice of Isaac, very central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's Abraham is looked at as the founder for all three of the great religions in the West. And this is the climax of the story of Isaac or Abraham, and that is that God told Abraham, I want you to kill your son to prove that you love me. And of course, he loved his son. Didn't want to do it, but there he is. He's going to do it. He's got his knife, and an angel comes and stops him right before the execution. And you see, that's the same thing happening here, coming from the other side. But anyway, one of the fabled stories about the Italian Renaissance. And again, more sculpture that's part of architecture. You can see an architectural space in a niche on the north side of San Michele, Florence, Italy. And so they come from the same place where sculpture is considered part of the architecture. But here is something that's totally different. Donatello, and this is 1411. Pretty early on, they kind of break away from that idea. They make sculpture what we would call today sculpture in the round. And this is Saint Mark, one of the four evangelists, one of the Saint Mark of the Gospels. And that's what he has in his hand. And you can see again this kind of incredible skill, realism, lifelike. And I'll show you something here that's really kind of cool, I think. You can see the veins. Let's see. Whoa. And one of the things that they do with this, they make sculpture appear so lifelike that you almost forget that it is made of marble. And in fact, it kind of invites you to suspend your disbelief. This looks like a real person, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong. David.
I sometimes wonder, like, based on the amount of detail that they put into like different sculptures and stuff like that, like the paintings and like the facial features and stuff like that. I sometimes wonder if like the sculptor actually got a live model to just like stand in front of them and like these on out, just so they could perfect like every part.
Oh, that's actually a good question. I have something of an answer for that. And the answer is yes, they would have models. There was no doubt about that. We know that based on the historical record. And we also know that the great sculptors, most of them that we know from the Renaissance, could really draw. They were the best draftspeople of the age. And so that's why when we get into 100 years from this, Michelangelo, you see those drawings from Michelangelo, and they're just like incredible. And he was one of those great sculptors. And we know about the people he had modeling, partly because he kept records of that. So yeah, they would have people model for long periods of time. And they also did lots of preliminary sketches to help them do that too. And your point is well taken. You can't get this realistic without intense observation. You got to see it to be able to do it. And so, yeah, that's Donatello. Here's St. George. And this is a relief sculpture. And again, they didn't quite move entirely away from this low relief sculpture, but I do want to get to Donatello. This is a good example of that 1-point perspective. And it's probably a good time to hit this point too, where the artists of Northern Europe were using camera obscura. The Italians more or less relied on mathematics, and the 1-point perspective is really math. It's geometry. It's putting geometry to good use to give you an illusion of 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional surface. And so here is a good example of, in the beginning, they didn't really quite understand all of the math. And so you can take this down, but they're like 2 vanishing points and 2 horizon lines. It's like they used the one to put together the flooring, the figures, and we know that it all converges here. But the building itself is in a different 1-point perspective. So in theory, there's a horizon line here and one there. They don't quite match up. But the idea that they were approaching art making through mathematics is one of the major differences between those people in the north making art and the people in the south. Here's those baptistry doors that ended up Gilberti was doing. I want to show you this. So, and this gets to another big difference between what goes on or what went on in Northern Europe versus Italy. This is David from the Old Testament. David and Goliath becomes King David, considered to be the founder of Israel. The 6-pointed star is called the Star of David. Big figure in Judaism. Heroic. Well, the story of David, bottom line, he was a hero because he killed Goliath. That was in the ancient times. Often when armies met up for battle, what they would do is that the armies would not fight each other. They would pick one guy from this side, one guy from the other side, and they'd have it out. A fight to the death. And the other guys had Goliath, who was a big, mean, scary guy. And nobody on David's side from the Israelites wanted to fight him. And David stepped up, and he was young. and he killed Goliath. And he became a hero, and it's legendary now. But what else is going on here? You can see this is the head of Goliath down there. You can see that. Here's his helmet, his beard, so on. What else is unusual about this sculpture?
He doesn't have any clothes on.
He's naked, yes, he does not have clothes on. This is the first time we've seen a nude in a long time. All of this art history we've been looking at. We saw a lot of nude figures in ancient Greece and Rome, but then you don't see them. People without clothes. And this is another big difference in the Italian Renaissance. Big difference being is that they wanted to be more like their ancestors in ancient Greece and Rome. And the idea of naked, nude figures becomes acceptable. And to our Europeans in Northern Europe, they were much more conservative. You don't see the nudes there. But these guys wanted to revive the culture of their ancestors. And there's a good reason for that. If you were in Italy in the 15th century, you had a bunch of stuff all around. Some of it in disrepair, some of it still pristine and as good as it was when it was created, but they had all of this stuff all around from the heyday of the Greco-Roman era. And so they were in the fields, the farmers, and they're digging up these statues of nude figures, and they were amazingly accurate. Maybe you ever heard of Venus de Milo? It's not that popular. Anyway, it's a famous sculpture, and it was dug up by some farmers in central Italy. And it was 1,500 years old. And the Venus de Milo is kind of famous because they never found the arms. The arms were broken. But they were finding buildings. They were seeing buildings all around them that they had no way that they could figure out how to do this. You went down to Rome, you could still see the Colosseum and the Pantheon. How'd they do it? Oh no. It's kind of a weird position to be in if you have a previous culture, a culture that died 1,000 years ago, and you're digging up stuff so advanced, you can't do it. You don't know how they did it. And that presented quite a challenge to the artists and the thinkers of Italy in the 15th century. And of course, they were making money too, just like our friends in the North. And they were actually starting to spend a lot of money. And they were going around Europe, and they could find some of the ancient Greek text. As I was saying, books were all made by hand. But there were a lot of surviving books from the Roman Empire and Hellenistic classical Greek works. That's why we still know about it. We know about Greek theater, the plays, the laws. We know who built the Parthenon because they kept records. And so they were like gobbling all of this stuff up. And they wanted to be like their ancestors, and that presented quite a challenge. And so when I asked that question again, what was it meant to do and how well did it do it? this is part of that question. They wanted to be as glorious as their ancestors from a millennia or a millennia and a half ago. That's why they call this the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical Roman and Greek culture. Now, there was no such motivation in Northern Europe. The only things that were there to aspire to were probably built by the Romans, you know. But, and they didn't see that it's particularly something they'd aspire to. But yeah, and the idea of the nude figures, the glorification of the human body. This lays the foundation for what will become an even larger shift or a disparity or disagreement, if you will, in the philosophies of the two cultures. We got Northern Europe, and by today's standards, they were much more conservative, and Italians were much more liberal, if you will. And so while the North would disdain nudity, the Italians embraced it. Of course, what happens in the next century is that we have the Protestant Reformation, which begins in Northern Europe. And they're saying the Catholics in Italy have lost their way. But that's probably a good place to end it. Any questions? I've been yapping and yapping. One more thing, Donatello, Penitent Mary Magdalene. Another issue. One of the things that the Italians start to do, they start to explore or at least challenge the notions of beauty. And if you take a look at this, it's kind of hard to imagine that it's kind of hard to describe this as beautiful. It's real. So anyway, we'll talk more about that when we come back on Monday.